Hey, folks, welcome to another episode of The Hole on the Corner. I'm Dan Peterson, aka Dr. Rockter. And yet again, I have a guest on the show. Recently did the panel with some other YouTubers. And as promised in a recent little teaser of that, we are managing to actually come through with getting none other than Dr. Andrew Ferguson on the channel today to talk about Lafferty with us. Watchers of this channel will have heard me reference Andrew quite a few times in my videos, often referencing certain sort of academic points he's made about Lafferty and the fact that he is Lafferty's biographer and has been working for some time on a biography of Lafferty, which I've seen tiny glimpses of, and it's like juicy, wonderful stuff. I've often also pointed people to his now not so active blog, continued on Next Rock, but the stuff that is up there where he goes through one story at a time by Lafferty continues to be just this brilliant resource of biographical details and manuscript details and really nice little potted interpretations of the stories as well. So Andrew is pretty big on my radar in terms of like Lafferty scholarship, and I've referenced him a lot, and we've been in touch for years, and we've also been in touch about him coming on here and been trying to plan that, and we've finally managed to get at least an episode in here, and we will see if we can do more in the future. But so for today, we'll hear a little bit about Andrew's story with Lafferty. We'll try to talk some past master. And of course, as I've mentioned before, Andrew wrote the introduction to the newer Library of America edition of Past Master that has come out. And it's a really interesting introduction with manuscript history and so on. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm remembering that when I have a background on, I can't actually hold up a book and expect it to show up on the screen. So it has to go be directly in front of my face, or it disappears. It disappears into the background here. But this edition, yes,
it's beautiful. It's the first time I've had sort of like live action special effects on my channel.
Such as it is. Thanks so much. It's really great to be here. I appreciate you inviting me on. I'm so glad we could work it out. Finally, it's been a very hectic summer. You know, we've been trying to get this together for quite some time, so I'm very glad to be on here with you.
Yeah.
It's always funny to hear myself. I know it's true technically, but to hear myself as Dr. Andrew Ferguson, I think generally the only who call me doctor are my sisters, and they're usually making fun of me. I think that's meant you know, in kindness, you know, in a sibling way, but.
I'm the same way. I'm the same way. I have very rarely heard it. Maybe like at a conference where I'm presenting a paper, and I'm always like, "What? Who's that?" You know?
Yeah, it always takes a second. Yeah, for that. But yeah, no, I'm really glad to be here talking to it. I've been enjoying listening to the series, the other materials on past masters, and been able to get through them. And it's you know, like all of Lafferty's work is just sort of an endless pool to dive into. You know, that you could. And you keep coming up with more and more interesting things. So excited to see what we can get to today.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad you feel that way about it. I don't know how other people will feel about it as they encounter it, but I'm actually personally blown away. There's more going on here than I even suspected, and it's more of a pool or a well, like a seemingly bottomless one. I mean, like the other authors I look at this in depth would be people like Cormac McCarthy, with novels like Blood Meridian and stuff. And it's, you know, Lafferty's work is different than that, but I'm finding there's a pretty similar level of like, whoa, these layers just don't stop. And or Gene Wolfe, I guess, you know, especially Book of the New Sun and stuff would be another comparison maybe, where it's like you're just not going to be able to stop kind of talking about possible interpretations and things going on here to one degree or another. I find at least resonances between works like that and Lafferty's. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's definitely is one of those that rewards, you know, continual study. I mean, I'm always of the opinion that every text is potentially infinite. You know, you can always sort of dig into them. But you know, the rewards that you get from doing it with some authors are so tremendous, and he's definitely one of those. You know, my own academic ones, and I guess I'll loop back around to my journey to this, but my own academic ones, you know, I think of you know, James Joyce I do a lot with, you know, Thomas Pynchon. These are the sort of levels of authors, I think, where you want to get in and analyze each word. You want to get in there and analyze like each phrase and how it relates, and
Yeah.
where it could possibly have come from. And he's so original in the way that he pulls in things and uses language that I won't ever get tired
Yeah.
of reading him, certainly.
Yeah. Yeah. And regarding that, like we're just talking about Past Master, which is so much richer than I had even realized. And I don't think Past Master is even really close to his most complex works.
No, yeah.
Be they individual novels, like, not to mention Camels, or certain connected series like the Argo mythos, of which the most famous one is The Devil is Dead. I mean, that stuff gets, honestly, I'm pretty sure it's as complex as, again, my frame of reference, works like Cormac McCarthy's. So it's, we're still kind of in the shallows with Lafferty, and there's plenty to do here.
Yeah, and I've put out there into the world, the idea that he certainly seemed convinced of, ultimately, that all of his stories were ultimately just one story, or they were just facets, or maybe slices through a single story. And this is something that he dwells on once in a while, and he very purposefully brings in characters or settings or little cameos from one of his sort of fictional worlds into another, in all violation of time and space otherwise. So you always sort of get these little glimpses where you can start piecing together, this larger Lafferty, what he called a ghost story.
Yeah.
But I do think Past Master has a pride of place in some ways, in that it really does connect some of this idea. The entire premise of the novel is connecting past premise, like a historical fiction character, to the sort of future world of space travel, of other inhabited worlds that mankind or other species have gone out to and filled, and inhabited with culture and religion and or lack of it, maybe, and all
Mm.
sorts of other things.
Yep.
So in a way, this Past Master speaks to the entire project that Lafferty was undertaking, whether he kind of knew what he was getting into at that point or not. And that he continues to do, bringing in this sort of like incredibly wide-ranging historical knowledge with a grasp, I think, not just on like the stuff of science fiction, the facts of science fiction, but also like a real deep theoretical understanding of what science fiction is equipped to do,
Mm.
what science fiction is capable of doing, and really using that to challenge his fellow writers, like, do more. You can be doing more. You could be doing so much more
Yeah.
than you're doing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So a couple things there. We're on a good riff here, so I want to keep doing this for a minute.
mhm.
And I'm going to ask you specifically. Tell me your story with Lafferty, but we've been touching on it. But you're reminding me of another thing about your take on Lafferty that has been important to me, and that is that you do thoroughly look at him in the context of science fiction itself, and especially as sort of a mode and the creativity of science fiction, and bouncing off of the context that he arose in and things like that. And I haven't really mentioned that much on the channel before, so this is a good opportunity to say that. And I have increasingly been looking at him in the context of science fiction, but I'm trying to look at him in a lot of other contexts as well, especially as sort of an American regional or bioregional writer. But I'm so glad you pointed that out about the sort of originary kind of status of Lafferty's larger body of work that Past Master emblematizes. And I have been starting to say that it's not only his like sort of seminal novel, but it's like a programmatic novel where he is kind of setting up a lot of what he's going to do. And I do think, whether I think other works are even more complex than this, I do think this is one of his most robustly philosophical novels. That's how it's hitting me on this read through. And it in certain ways is like a carnival version of a philosophical dialogue, like something that Plato would have written, or maybe Hume, or some of these people that do these sorts of dialogues. But like that, obviously mashed up with a lot of other stuff, but it has certain qualities. And I'm finding when you dig into some of these conversations, it's some pretty profound stuff. But I agree that, yeah, it's he's really setting up something here and I have said recently that it's now hitting me that I think Past Master might be the novel of his that becomes a part of the, you know, English literature canon, the American literary canon, even if, as I've said before, it's almost like a little wormhole portion of the canon. So yeah, it's a great work. Don't get me wrong. But yeah, so those
Yeah,
are great.
it's
Go ahead.
I guess I'll dwell while we're on him in science fiction, since is it's honestly the funny thing is like for him it was almost an accident that he ended up writing
Hmm.
primarily in science fiction.
Hmm.
He when he was first decided to take up writing again, in sort of in very much a classical sort of midlife crisis phase, you
Hmm.
would think, you know, and it actually hits me because I'm the same age as
Hmm.
Lafferty was when he took to writing again.
Hmm.
So I'm very aware. I was like, maybe I should be, yeah. But what am I actually doing?
Yeah.
But he wrote all sorts of things. He took a correspondence fiction course. He wrote samples of sort of like men's own fiction and mysteries and suspense and even a vague sort of like stab at a romance or two. Sort of he tried to write a lot of different genres of what was like in pulp production at the time.
Hmm.
And it just so happened that science fiction will prove to be what sold for him. I think
Yeah.
he probably even liked mysteries more. I think he would have maybe at one point in his life would have preferred if mysteries had taken off for him.
Yeah.
And his knowledge of science fiction was not the same as his contemporaries in the field.
Hmm.
He knew because he was older for one part. Coming into it as a middle-aged man rather than like a fresh-faced teenager, like so many science fiction writers do when they first cut their teeth. So he had older reference points. He was much more of a um, an adventure story guy than anything
Hmm.
else. That was his upbringing, was reading the sort of the great Victorian and American adventure writers. That was his bookshelf as a child. And so when he went to do science fiction and he's like, well, this is selling, I guess I better like catch myself up on it. He just crash coursed in the last few years of what had sold and what was considered to be great in science fiction, and picked out what he could from it, and sort of in his way that Gregorio Montejo, I think, a mutual friend of both of ours and another Lafferty scholar, calls it his bricolage. So
Hmm.
he's like, well, it's if I'm gonna have if science fiction is what sells, then let me go raid science fiction and pick out the bits that I can use to do what I was probably going to do anyway. But
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is it's interesting to consider the Lafferty who might have been a mystery writer or in other genres, but I'm very happy we got the Lafferty we got. So
Yeah, and that's something maybe we can speculate on in the future and talk about with manuscript history and things. I feel really mixed about all that. Like I have come to appreciate so much. I mean, I've always liked his prose, but his just bare prose, apart from certain kinds of fireworks and stuff, more and more I appreciate it. Um, and I've seen bits and pieces of him writing in these sort of other genres, some of which I think are stronger than others, but he can certainly write quite strongly in others. I mean, for me, my favorite stuff that's outside science fiction would be his early, uh, if you want to call them like literary stories that were in the literary journals, like The Wagons.
mm-hmm.
Um, or I don't know where this one first came out, but it strikes me as in the same vein as a story like Rain Mountain
Yeah.
and some of these others. I love those stories, and they bring in something of what we love in science fiction, in Lafferty's science fiction, in terms of there is this pretty profound imaginative quality, but it's much more adjacent to something like magical realism, or just authors like, I don't know, Flannery O'Connor or Cormac McCarthy or something, that aren't necessarily doing something magical, but there is like a slight mythic resonance there or something like that. And there, so the stuff that Lafferty wrote in that vein is probably my next favorite or equal to the science fiction stuff. However, I would like to think that if he had been a crime fiction writer or whatever, he still would have found his way into some of the absolutely mind-bending
Yeah.
stuff that
Yeah.
he does, whether it's cosmically or paranormally or whatever. And that's the exciting thing to me, that he did end up in science fiction, is it gave him a chance to stretch his legs in that area. And of course, as you're saying, he rated it and then just did what he wanted with it, which a lot of which was like thought experiments and philosophical type things. And also, I don't know what to call, in my type of language, I would say that he was doing, sort of ontic adventuring or ontological adventuring, and that's a great point about the adventure stories. I am so happy that he has an impulse toward adventure writing. Like, it's just because I love the hardcore, like, philosophy and speculation and these sorts of things. But if you can tell that in a rip roaring, style, or as he says of the devilfish, and that you suggest is of, it applies to the whole novel, that it's a roaring comedy, in Past Master, that he can write these roaring comedies that do this philosophical work, is, for me, just like, that's a perfect marriage.
Well,
That's like
this
good
is
stuff.
what he was very insistent on, is that fiction, that it needs to be fun. And he
Mm.
used that word, that specific word, a number of
Mhm.
times. In fact, one of his early ideas when he was like pulling together stories for his first attempt at an anthology, he used the man underneath, which we probably don't have time to go into, but as the man underneath as a story, as his title story, and the subtitle was something like stories on the subconscious called the ocean, on the theme of fun in fiction. It
Mm.
was something, and which is just such a loaded, is already such a loaded thing. That's it. The oceanic subconscious, which plays obviously a big role in Past Master as well, and through a lot of his work. But then this idea that fiction has to be fun. You can be philosophical. It doesn't mean that it has to be dumbed down in any way. In fact, it would be the opposite. Like, the dumbing down of it, contributes to what for him is the opposite of fun, which is tedium. And
Mm.
he will over and over again, he will condemn the specific
Mhm.
idea he has of heroic tedium.
Mhm.
And when he criticizes other science fiction writers, it's usually on the basis that he just finds their work like insufferably tedious to read. And in ways like that he did not make him many friends in some ways, like, or certainly made him some enemies, some of the people that he went after.
Yeah.
But he was um, it has to be enjoyable. There has to be something that hooks you in there.
Yeah.
And I think that is the classic adventure story in many ways, and something that can get lost very easily if we're just doing these sort of really didactic fables over
Yeah.
and over and over again. However worthy, the educational yield of the story is meant to be. If it's not fun, like, nobody's going to enjoy it. Like, it's the type of story that you assign in a class, and you're just like, well, we're going to slog through this one, and then but it's because there's a payoff, like, and you're just kind of
Yeah.
dreading it going in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me say three quick things to that, and ask you a question on the back of that. One is that I've said often on the channel that it seems to me that fun was like borders on being like an ontological category for Lafferty. And I know I bang on about metaphysics, but that's kind of my thing. And I actually see evidence that that was very important to Lafferty, although probably more at an implicit level, though he could be explicit about it. Um, and I was just thinking today, like, what do I mean by that? How would I even begin to talk about fun as something ontological? And I'm thinking about that, but I don't have anything to say about it right now. But I'm throwing that one out there just to
Mhm.
keep that thread going on my channel. But and then with like heroic tedium and things you got to get through no matter how noble and stuff, like, unfortunately, and I've said this on my channel, and I'm way overdue for a revisit, but that is very much how I found Le Guin's The Dispossessed. And it didn't help that I had read the Earthsea Chronicles before that, which I found amazing and
Yeah,
beautiful.
I think
And this just
I still
felt sort
think,
of
yeah, Tahanu
dry
in
by
particular, I
comparison.
think is one of just an absolute joy of a book. Well, I mean, it's a searing book. It's a difficult book, but it's just an absolutely brilliant book.
Sorry,
In
which one?
that sense. Tahanu,
Oh
the
yeah,
fourth one
the
in the
fourth
series.
one.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. No, I know. Yeah. So, um, but it made me curious, of any of the authors that you happen to know for sure that he did complain were tedious or were heroic tedium. Do you disagree with him on any of those? Because I think I heard that Stanislaw Lem might have been one of them, and I've only read Solaris, but I loved Solaris. I didn't find it is dense, but I didn't find it tedious. So I was just curious, like, do you
I,
disagree
I
with
think
Lafferty on
he,
that?
I think he probably put Lem on there. I mean, I think. Hmm. there are certain, I don't know. I would need to go back through one by
Mhm.
one and verify what he actually said
Yeah,
about
fair
each
enough.
one of them. And some of it is just like he did a little bit of like what I think he might have thought was good-natured ribbing
Yeah.
at some point that was not taken as such, and
Hmm.
in some ways probably should not have been taken as such. He
Hmm.
probably pushed some boundaries he should.
Hmm.
He probably pushed against some things that went against, courtesy
Yeah.
in some ways,
Yeah.
that he thought was maybe, authorial flighting or ribbing or something.
Mhm.
But I mean, there are some of them that definitely like took a dislike to him and made it known. I think Spider Robinson was one that like, very famously had a grudge against him for a panning that Lafferty gave one of his works.
Mhm.
Um, and there's a lot of the other ones, but some of them even like I mean he went after Fred Pohl's work pretty hard. And Pohl still was like, well, I'm going to keep was still going to publish him. He
Mhm.
didn't
Yeah.
let that interfere with with the business side of things.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
so and then too, I do think he thought science fiction that explored things that were outside of the framework of Lafferty's own. He would not have called himself conservative. It was a label he rejected very
Mm.
strenuously.
Mm.
But that we might recognize certainly as at least a cultural conservatism. Science fiction that explored gender, science fiction that explored sexuality, that explored other sort of boundaries in life. Those are ones that I think he was sort of like inclined against.
Right.
But for those reasons, which is not to say that some of those are not extremely tedious, because some of them really really are.
Yeah.
And I would need to dig back in before I get myself into enough trouble as to
Sure.
give specific examples
Yeah.
on a one by one basis. We might have a chance to discuss sort of Delaney's reaction to Lafferty, if not today, then another day.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, no, it was just a side thought because, I like love his general sort of theory about science fiction and his even like his whole salty, spicy, like it really makes me wince sometimes at some of the harsh things he says. But I'm I do understand that he at least there are times when I always feel that Lafferty gets too mean, and like not just like, oh, that was mean. I mean, it's like, ooh, that's kind of a ugly, dark heart attitude. That's my biggest qualm with Lafferty here and there. But that said, a lot of the time when he's doing some of those acerbic things, I do feel him meaning to have a lot of fun, and some of it I can take in a pretty fun, funny way. And from what I've been listening to other, YouTubers and podcasters talking about Dish and so many of these other authors, from the sounds of it, they all got pretty pretty harsh with each other, man, and like kind of
yeah,
had
no,
some
well,
like
yeah,
some textual hate wars in the the fanzines or whatever of the time, and these sorts of things. So Lafferty wasn't exactly alone in these kinds of things. But
yeah.
so my point being, I may not even agree with some of his applications to various authors, yet I like some of what he's getting at, regardless.
Absolutely, yeah. Um, Yeah, I mean, it was very clearly a fresh breath in the science fiction of that time. Just the style, the language, the humor. He was pretty immediately recognized, especially obviously it helped once Virginia Kid was backing him, the sort of the super agent that could push pretty much anybody into science fiction stardom at that point. But he was already a very well established writer before, and that's why she went to him. You know,
Mm.
she didn't take solicitations from people. She went to authors and said, "I will represent you."
Uh-huh.
So it's not like he applied to her.
Right.
Um, so he definitely has something to say, and I think that holds true. Even people who were, as I say in the forward somewhere, who were diametrically opposed to his own, ideas on culture, on
Yeah.
religion, on philosophy, still took a great deal away from him. And some of them still, like Terry Bisson, for instance,
Mhm.
is a very much a man of the left, and also a man who uh, you know continually pushed and endorsed and promoted Lafferty to the end of his days.
Yeah.
So I think he gained a lot of fans who recognized the chops, and that's what
Yeah.
they were there for.
I mean, I feel like I don't know exactly who are the overtly sort of conservative authors in science fiction per se, but I I feel as if I've almost exclusively seen left-leaning authors be the ones who promote Lafferty. You know what I mean? That's quite
I mean,
interesting.
well, Wolf obviously I think would
Well,
be
yes,
one of
yes.
his biggest
Both.
fans, and there's a few others,
Yeah.
and uh, but yeah, it's interesting to see. Like the milieu at the time was interesting. This is also the time, of course, that Galaxy and magazines were running side by side, pro and anti-Vietnam
Yeah.
War, columns, and so you had a sort of the appearance of a break, largely of generations, but not entirely,
Mhm.
between in science fiction at that point. So there was yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say too at this time that there's a lot going on. There's quite
Yes.
a bit going on.
It's,
All of which is to say, I think his arrival in science fiction was felt, was welcomed, was needed in many ways, and he did bring a level of artistry and fun
mhm.
could often be lacking from some of the
Yeah.
science fiction of the era, as revolutionary as a lot of it was, and he gets pulled into the new wave like a lot of other people, like without being actually a part of it. And it's hard to say in retrospect that the new wave existed in the way that we wanted it to exist, other than maybe in the mind of like Harlan Ellison or something. Um, and even he like rejected it at some point.
Mhm.
But and he came along at a time too, like, but I think where what we established in the new wave is sort of loosening up content restrictions was part of it, but also more daring
Mhm.
prose.
Mhm.
Modernism arriving sort of slightly late to science fiction is sort of and they had pulp modernism before, but the more high modernism
Mhm.
possibilities
Mhm.
something like a Delaney's Dahlgren or
Mhm.
that makes it possible to do these things.
Yeah.
Um, he was embraced in that way in a way that he probably wouldn't have been a decade before and probably wouldn't have been a decade later.
Yeah.
He sort of fell out of favor as a result, especially
Mhm.
as the 1980s when science fiction starts changing under various pressures that again we'll get to
Yeah.
at some point.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah. Well, I will conjecture here that I think Lafferty continues to be that a very similar sort of shot in the arm when and where he is freshly discovered, including up to this moment. That's my impression. But speaking of his arrival on that scene, let's now circle back and what was Lafferty's arrival in your life? Tell us a little bit about your story, just with science fiction and reading and all these sorts of things, but and how Lafferty comes into that. Go.
sure. Um, as probably isn't a surprise, I was a bookish kid. That was what I did. I taught myself to read at a very young age, and just picked up whatever I could. I never really had any barriers on what I could or couldn't read, or I didn't never had adults tell me, no, that's too old for you. Don't read that. So I did. I think I read Tom Sawyer when I was like 4 or 5.
Mm.
It was like it was picking up the biggest books I could and reading them. And so I ended up reading a lot of the same sort of adventure classics, or Jekyll and Hyde, Treasure Island, Kidnapped, you know, those sorts of those sorts of books, the adventure novels like King Solomon's Mines and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And getting a sense of that. And I'm a kid. I don't know anything about colonialism or anything like that. I had to fill those details in for myself later.
Well,
But it
if I
did
could
give
just interrupt you right there, just why in the world were those particular types of novels around you at that age?
my
Rather than
family had like these, around me, these sort of Reader's Digest type
okay,
books, and not the condensed ones. They're like
right,
these are like the weirdly, they looked like they were supposed to be like nice books to sit on a shelf. They're
hmm
like they leather bound with like the
hmm
little satiny bookmarks and
yeah,
gilded pages and stuff like that. But they were just existed to like sit on people's shelves and
right,
make it look like they had books. But I read them because that's what I could grab and read.
yeah,
When I was a kid, I didn't, especially in the early grades, like there was just no point in me like paying attention in class because like I already knew it. And I don't say that to like, it's just like class is boring when you're a bookish kid and like you're
right,
you're reading full novels, and like the kids are still doing chapbooks and stuff like
Right.
that. So for a couple of years of elementary school, also like my teachers just gave up and let me wander to the library whenever I wanted to. I could just pick
Mhm.
up whatever and go that. So that's I just read constantly. I became as every probably American bookish kid does. I went through a major Tolkien phase.
Mhm.
Um, that and the with the sort of the Anglophilia that comes along with it, this longing for some sort of like again the Oxfordian situation, and you're just sitting around and
Same.
talking with other writers and things. And that's really what I wanted to do. Is like, if you'd asked me then, I would have said, what I wanted to do when I grew up, it was like just read books and talk to smart people about them. That was
Mm.
that was all I ever really wanted to do. When I went to undergrad at St. John's College, which is relevant because it's a great books program. It's one that
Mhm.
Homer to Heidegger is sort of like the shorthand that so
Nice.
you start there, like your first night of class, they toss you into the first six sections of the Iliad, and then you sort of go from there, and um, so I got a crash course in a lot of of philosophy of all sorts of stuff that goes through there. And then I just sort of I was still reading a whole bunch, but I was just working in bookstores,
Mm.
and sort of trying to make my way into something. I thought for a while maybe I could be a poet. I was wrong
Mm.
about that.
Okay.
I'm not a very good poet. Thought I could be a writer of fiction.
Mhm.
I am an okay writer of fiction, but I can't produce it quickly enough. I
Mm.
just can't go do enough fiction to do that. So after a couple of years of thinking, oh, maybe I'll get an MFA, maybe something. I did journalism for a little while, just again
Mm.
because I was writing. I learned a little bit more about how to write to a deadline, but only to a deadline,
Mm.
which is also a problem. Um, as a writing habit when you only can write to a deadline.
Yeah.
The and I didn't none of those things was like a thing where I was like, I want to dedicate my life to this.
Mm.
Um, but I did start realizing, I when I first encountered Lafferty, it was as a book. I think it was one of those sort of the Wild Side books that was the print on demand Lafferty's
Mhm.
that was ordered
Yeah.
in, and it may even have been Past Master. May have
Mhm.
been the first Lafferty that I got because that came into the store, and I bounced off it so hard. It just wasn't. I wasn't prepared for it. It was
Mm.
something I'd first seen mentioned. The reason I actually I knew to pick it up in the first place. I've seen it mentioned on the blog that Neil Gaiman was running for his
Okay.
American Gods book. That was where he sort of started his blogging.
Right.
And I know there's a whole Neil Gaiman thing right now. At some point, I will address this and we'll talk about it, and
Yeah.
there will be we'll work out what this means for the Lafferty situation.
Right.
Obviously, Gaiman has been a major backer of Lafferty's fiction. So we'll talk about that. That is being worked out, and is not the
Mm.
subject here today. But I did, without that blog, I would not have discovered
Mm.
Lafferty's fiction. I did give it another try soon after, like about a year later, and this time what I got was 900 Grandmothers,
Mm.
and getting it in the short story form, and as a sort of like a series of them, like and being able to see like, oh, he can work in a lot of modes. This is really funny. Almost clicked immediately right away. And
Mm.
so I started slowly acquiring some of his other books and reading them. And there was a point at which I remember I was reading Fourth Mansions. And I was reading it, and something about it just like jived in every way with what I was trying to figure out in my life. I was reading a lot of that was in the middle of my journalism phase, but I was reading a lot of nonfiction history at that point, just huge amounts of it. Because at St. John's you read primary text. I hadn't had a chance to read
Okay.
really secondary text unless it was like Thucydides or something. That was the history that you get there. Um, that I was reading Fourth Mansions, and in contrast with all this history and folklore that I was reading as well. And I was like, I have to read every word that this man's ever written. That's what I'm going to have to do. It was as a certainty in my mind, like that this is something I have to do with my life is track down and read every word, whatever that means. I didn't know what that meant
Mm.
at that point. And so I started getting other of his books. That was at a time where they weren't all through the roof. Like you still could get
Yeah.
some of the books for even, prices of what I was getting as and working for this little, politics and culture mag.
Mm.
I could afford to get some of the books and read them. Then it dawned on me, well, this is a guy, like, I could actually study.
Mm.
Um, and maybe I could look at grad school. I looked at it for an MFA. I looked at it for other things that didn't work out or didn't seem right to me. But I was like, well, he's got to have papers somewhere. And I found them. They were, in fact, the University of Tulsa. So I contacted them. That was the only school I applied to. I had no, interest in doing anything else, certainly at that time. And they gave me a research fellowship to come in, and said, it was fortunate timing, because it had only been within the last year or two before that they had cataloged everything. Since he died in 2002, his papers made their way over to Tulsa, and then I ended up there in the summer of 2007.
Mm.
So they had finished cataloging the papers, I think, only a year or two, maybe 3 years earlier.
Mm.
And they had a person who was in Mark Carlson at the University of Tulsa Library, who was had known Ray Lafferty through the Oklahoma science fiction writers group.
Mm-hmm.
So he was also somebody who wanted these papers to be used,
Mm.
who wanted them out, and was a big supporter of mine there as well. So I did that. I did a thesis project there. I went to the University of Liverpool, which has for a year, which has a very large science fiction library,
Mm-hmm.
and did a further master's, which you don't always need. I don't think you really need two masters, but it gave me another year to write Lafferty and to learn more about science fiction generally, to fill in a lot of my gaps and stuff. And then by that point, I was like, well, I think I've got enough to write his biography, and I started the process of getting that proposal chiseled out, while also starting into doing a PhD, because I was like, at this point, yeah, I want to be a teacher, I want to be a professor.
Mm.
I want to teach literature. I want to learn more about more things. At Tulsa, I also did a lot of modernism study. They were very strong in literary modernism. So I thought I would be, a 20th century scholar of Anglophone modernism, basically.
Mm.
Um, and I did get the PhD, but the process of writing the dissertation, which was not Lafferty, was never going to be a dissertation that I could do at the PhD level. For one thing, I already had what I needed. I didn't need to write the dissertation at that point on
Right.
him. And for another thing, I thought, well, I can bring in these other things. There are other things
Yeah.
there, and life slows down in a lot of ways. It's been a very long decade since then, and the biography has sat largely, little bits here and there I've added on. I've gone and done other research other places, and I got to say, I've done research on the Lafferty project in many places.
Mm.
Including going to the Virginia Kid Agency and talking to them there. They've been very, very kind and very helpful to a multitude of libraries beyond Tulsa, tracking down his military records, tracking down all sorts of things. I've done a lot more stuff, but I'm hoping finally, getting on the other side of getting a steady job, not as a professor, but as an advisor in academia,
Mm-hmm.
getting settled in, my family that I've
Yeah.
started and had in the meantime, getting and also getting to the other side of a worldwide pandemic, I think will help too. That can finally sit down and finish writing this thing and get it out. Because I know people have been waiting, mostly, I think, and I think everybody waiting very patiently for this to emerge. And yeah, I'm very eager to see that work out in the world. But I think, my approach to Lafferty is like Lafferty himself. He was an autodidact. Everything he picked
Mhm.
up, he threw into his fiction, and that's what I feel like. I've done in my approach to him is like everything I've picked up along the way from those first books I was picking up, very young, learning about what fiction is, what it was, where it can take you,
Yeah.
to all the academic study, and then even also, being out in the real world, working as a bookseller. Lafferty worked as a clerk at an electric store,
Mhm.
as an electric parts store for 30, 40 years of his life. That's what he did. Other than those few years he was in the military, that's what he did. He was a
Yeah.
electrical parts salesman. Um, And so just trying to, I was prepared uniquely for it in other, other than not being Catholic. I think that's the only way that I could have been more prepared to be the person to end up writing this is actually have the cultural background of Catholicism. I come from,
Yeah.
an evangelical, a Presbyterian background, I guess,
Uh-huh.
quasi-evangelical. But I've had the appoint, I've had the St. Thomas, I've had the
Mm,
Aristotle, I've had some of the
mm,
things I need, and I've
yeah.
tried to fill in the gaps elsewhere where I can, and has brought me to this, and I'm really grateful, also that have developed, all these other scholars like yourself,
Mm,
like Gregorio, like these other people who
mm,
are working and able to fill in so many of the gaps that I have, because he's
mm.
definitely a writer who needs rooms full of people working on him. It needs
Absolutely.
departments and conferences and stuff
Yeah.
dedicated to, as we did. We started LAFCON,
Yeah.
dedicated to his work.
Yeah.
So he supports it. So I'm glad to have been a part of bringing Lafferty to, even the wider world that we've been able to, and
Yeah.
hope that will
Yeah.
continue.
Man, I remember actually running into I can't remember if it was like running into you by you making a comment on my blog, or possibly seeing something about your work online first, or I can't remember what, but early days, when all that was happening, and just being blown away. I think I was still not cognizant of myself yet that I was going to become a scholar. I was, kind of doing, the whole autodidact thing. I was constantly studying and reading academic books and all this kind of stuff, all more as a hobby, and I had little dreams of, at way back when, it would have been more like I wanted to write a thesis or something. I don't even think I thought in terms of thesis, but like on like C.S. Lewis's space trilogy or something would have been what I was thinking about way back then, or maybe some Chesterton. um, but I was like deep into Lafferty, and what little bit you could find online with, I don't know how to say this one site, but I'm sure you'll remember the Mule Cybernetic or whatever
Really,
site.
yeah,
Yes.
the Moloch cybernetic, yeah,
Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah. And reading what you could of his little things on there and finding comments here and there. But when you came along and you were already in process of either writing that dissertation or had finished it recently, I can't remember which, and had this knowledge and had been to the archives that I didn't know existed, like it opened up this whole other world, and it was really exciting. It was like, oh my God, like you can like study Lafferty, and like there's a lot more to know here and stuff, and that was, I feel very grateful that I ran into you and that world of, in that way, just at the right time, where I was already deep into Lafferty, and but I was still in those early days of like still trying to find all the different works, and one story here and one story there and all
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So it was still early enough that like then running into you was like, oh man, this thing just gets bigger and bigger and more interesting. And yeah, that was really exciting. I will say that Lafferty wrote in Past Master, speaking of Past Master, about uh, your eventual biography. It's the position that we all take when he says, does it come? Will it happen? And he just keeps saying, be quiet, we watch, be quiet, we wait, be quiet, we hope. Those are the last words of Past Master, and that's how we're all just. I just have this quiet faith. It doesn't matter when it happens, that it's going to happen someday. I look
It
forward
will, yeah, no, it's again, I really hate the feeling that I've strung everybody out this long, which was far from my intention. It's just, other things that I've also discovered about myself, which is pretty obvious in hindsight, both with me and family history, but like, the level of ADHD I have and was just unmedicated completely throughout this
Mm,
time. That did not, I think, help matters, especially when trying to write an entirely different, PhD dissertation,
yeah,
on top of trying to finish a biography and finish all these other things, and certain things just have to go to the back burner for a
yeah,
while.
yeah,
Was trying to find employment year after
yes,
year in
yeah,
academia, as the job market and the idea of being a professor sort of like collapsed around me, around us too.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, it was so gratifying, and I've loved watching. I really enjoyed watching your development as a scholar, like that you sort of went from, like, yeah, like sort of this, a wide-eyed fan, to developing a set of ideas and pursuing it like really really doggedly and through these things. And
Yeah.
I thought it was very useful, for me. And I don't just say this because, I'm not just blowing smoke here. Like, I think it's extremely useful ways of looking at his fiction, and especially useful as put in the introduction to Past Master. But I
Yeah.
did feel like especially those first 2 years in Tulsa, I always felt like I'm living in his town. I'm walking the streets he walked. I'm looking at his stuff, and in the meantime, I get to like just sit back and talk to people. Talk to the editor of the James Joyce Quarterly about
Mm,
James Joyce.
mm.
It felt like I was getting away with something. Like
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
the point in life where I was like, it can't be this easy. Like, and it turns
Yeah.
out it can't. But for a little while, it can be. You can
Yeah.
have that for a little while.
Well, I'm the same
Um,
way. I'm the same way in that, like when I did my PhD on my whole idea of the eco monstrous plus about Lafferty and a little bit of McCarthy, like, I very much felt like I was getting away with something. And I couldn't believe it when I finished it, when I did the viva, as they call it here, and I had no corrections I could not believe
that's
that,
that, which is I think I should say here for as an American academic, we expect that defenses, like dissertation defenses, will be that there might be a little heat in there, but they're going to pass you. Like
right.
they don't you don't go to it, they don't let you get to a dissertation defense if they're going to fail you, unless you completely have like a medical incident or something, like sort of like, or you have really pissed somebody off and they want to hang you out to dry,
Yeah.
in which case you should see it coming. But in the UK system, that's not guaranteed at all. Like you can walk into that room and not know, am I going to have to, correct this, or are they going to like, knock me back and I'll have to take another year and
Yeah.
try to come
Yeah.
back next year? Like there's no guarantee there. So, and I think
Yeah.
coming through with
They,
no corrections at all is outstanding.
well, they, you cannot believe the amount of sleep I lost in like the month or so just before that, or not before the Viva, before I handed in the text. But uh, yeah, they do try to prepare you to the point where your supervisor is it's gonna reflect poorly on your supervisor if you like out and out fail. But I mean, most of anyone I've ever spoken to about it needed to go away and fix some stuff based on
Mhm.
the defense,
Yeah.
and that could take anywhere from months to a year to sort some stuff out. And I did kind of lose my mind right at the end, just trying to. I went back through because I had made some pretty major changes that then affected the entire text,
Mm.
and I had to make sure it all tied up. So I was literally sleeping 4 hours at a time, within childcare and other things. I was basically sleeping 4 hours, working 4 hours, sleeping 4 hours, working for like in a month straight. I didn't mean to; it just happened, yeah. And so I was like tying all these things together until I literally felt insane. I literally had my main thing I listened to was uh, Sun's album, Life Metal. For some reason, that worked for me so perfectly. It was the right amount of like wall of unbelievable noise that still had this like it suggests in its imagery and stuff, this like fire and brightness to it that like simultaneously was like pressuring me and lifting me up. And I don't know, but anyway, that's a really important album to me because of where it was in my life. But anyway, yeah. And like, so I felt like a bit crazy. Yeah, I think I'd gotten over that craziness because the Viva was months after that, so I didn't
Right.
feel
Yeah.
that as much. But I thought for sure, like I was like, I know I worked really hard, I know I'm not going to blow this at this point, but I'll be interested to see what I have to fix here. You know what I mean? and
I mean,
when
when
they
I
went
when
out,
I finished
it
when
was
I finished my
online.
dissertation,
Yeah, no,
when I
go
finished
ahead.
my doctoral dissertation, it was and I'd gone up to the line with my MA thesis, on Lafferty, the Liverpool one. I'd gone up to the line with that because I expanded my Tulsa one quite a great deal. And it's the Liverpool one that's still online that you can sort of get the bones of my Lafferty thought there.
Yeah.
But my doctoral dissertation, I had to check myself into basically like a kitchenette motel, and just like get some freezer food and
Yeah.
unplug the TV, turn it to the wall, throw a blanket over it, whatever,
Yeah.
and just like I existed in that room, for I think I don't even know how many days I was in there. I really lost track, but it was like somewhere between 10 and 14, I think.
Yeah.
And I lost track of night and day for multiple times. Every day or two, I would remember to call my mom and just say like, "I'm still alive. It's okay. Or, don't worry."
Yeah.
But yeah, that was the only way I was able to get a draft done.
Yeah.
of the dissertation, and then I had to turn around and defend it really quickly, and then go straight
Right.
into a temporary teaching job.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, the rush to it, yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah.
It's it,
Speaking of,
it takes a lot out of you on the other side too. I think is the
oh
other
man,
thing. Like the
I
recovery period is pretty
yeah.
brutal.
Yeah, I feel like well, I had some personal circumstances happen throughout all that. And like when I handed it in was let's see, a few days before I think I handed in, came the emails from the university and then from everywhere else going, by the way, everything's shut down, stay in your homes and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, like
Yeah,
literally that
yeah.
moment of lockdown and stuff. And it was eerie as hell, man, on so many levels. But as I was so I managed to say just a tiny thing about it in my tiny little preface about COVID-19. But yeah, it was, and so yeah, so I've had a lot to recover from that, and have really still kind of coming out of that in some ways. Uh, but yeah, speaking of writing to a deadline, I'm very much like that, unfortunately, as well. And I think I do think there's undiagnosed ADHD that I'm on a waiting list for to be checked out. And but I was also thinking, like, I would love to see Lafferty write a story about the likes of us, and I'm pretty sure he did in one way or the other. And
Oh yeah, yeah,
it's like,
yeah. I mean, I have my suspicions, in certain ways about him as well. That his own neurodivergence, I think.
yeah,
But maybe for another day. But
yeah,
I think overall, like, you mentioned also my blog. Like, yeah, I'm
yes,
still intent on going through. I will do a piece on every Lafferty story. I will do it. It's just
yeah,
when I can get back up, and hopefully this position I'm in now will offer a little bit more time even to do the bitty writing like that to get
yeah,
myself back in the routine of it. I also will get stuck for long periods of time. If I'm stuck on a story, sometimes like I'm just waiting. Specifically right now, I'm waiting for one person to get me a document. I've been waiting for some time, but I also forget to remind them about it. So I've got to try to like track that down,
yeah,
um, and reconsolidate everything. Um, all of which is to say, the work goes on,
yeah,
and it is still happening. And I've got, I would say in terms of how where the research stands, like I've got basically everything I need. There's like one more out, like other like there's little bits and pieces and letters and documents and stuff that are still out there, but I don't necessarily need. But I've
mm,
got most of what I need,
mm,
for everything. It's just a matter of sitting down and getting the whole in mind again. That's the
yeah.
challenge now, is to get
But
all of Lafferty in my head the way that it has been in previous
sure,
eras.
sure. Well, I know from my perspective, and I think I speak for a lot of people. Uh, as we've said, Lafferty is about fun and deeper, or behind, or really equivalent to that. Joy, um, the comic view of life in a very large sense, etc. I think we would desire that you only be able to write that. It's going to be hard work. There's going to be tough parts of it, but out of some kind of joy and fun. So, please don't feel pressure, and just take your time to get yourself to that place, get centered and grounded and zen about it all, and then it'll happen.
I can ever make the process of writing fun for me. I think that the process of writing is always going to be, I mean, I really, not to be the crass, it's always felt sort of like vomiting, in that
Mm,
like you have to get it out, and you feel
mm.
better once it's done, but you don't necessarily want to look at it afterwards, like or not. It's like you gotta. So yeah, that's one of the challenges, but we'll get back into it.
Yeah.
I'm gearing myself back up. Usually, eventually, like then this ties back into Lafferty. Eventually, I get to the point where I like kind of forgot I wrote something, or I forgot the way I wrote it or anything, and I can go back and view it sort of dispassionately.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and Lafferty sort of did this thing where he said, he had this, he would just tuck stories in drawers. And then
Hmm.
like later on, he would just like come across them again, and like
Hmm.
maybe he would be far enough distant from them that he had figured something out, or he would give them another go, or like he
Yeah.
could combine them with something else.
Yeah.
So he was always sort of like, if a story didn't work, if he busted on it, as he said, he
Yeah.
would he would tuck it away and work on another one.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and by the way, just to let everybody know, that kind of thing that Andrew is talking about here is what you'll see on his blog. It's just these pretty short entries on individual stories, and you get a lot of that kind of detail coming out in as he's just trying to describe the story and the writing of it
Yeah.
and stuff. And I find it invaluable. It's inspiring as a writer myself, and it's funny because I've only just recently in my life been experiencing some of that, being able to see both academic writing and otherwise kind of afresh that I haven't touched for a while, and seeing it with a little bit of objectivity, which has been super helpful. So it's interesting that Lafferty, was conscious of that.
And I
So
think it's also, yeah, what I'm able to do there, I think, is dig more into the manuscripts, dig more into stuff that is like, is just fascinating to the stories and is less relevant to his life, the life arc that I'm trying to tell in the biography. And we're getting away, so we'll steer back onto you. But I will say the last really big post I did on the blog was finding that there was an edition of One at a Time that came out. I don't even know that, I don't think he knew that it had that it had been printed in this magazine, but it came out in this sort of like very sort of softcore porn, like men's magazine.
oh, I
And then,
saw that.
yeah,
Yep.
they commissioned original illustrations for it and
Yeah,
everything,
they're
but
cool.
he kept really detailed, records of when his stories stole and everything, and that was never mentioned. I never, until I like stumbled upon that, in the depths of like the Internet Science Fiction database or something. Somebody had like tagged it.
Yeah.
Until I followed up on it and got it in, like I don't think anybody knew that existed otherwise. And I certainly don't think that he did. I certainly don't think Virginia Kidd did, because she did an accounting of all of his publications as well. It's not listed in.
Yeah,
So
that's an amazing
it's
find. Yeah, people should go look at the blog and see the illustrations there. They're so good. Um, so we'll try to move on from all this, but I want to ask a couple of quick questions related to your story with Lafferty. I'm curious. Well, first of all, I do think it's fascinating that you happen to be from an early time a reader of the great books, and that kind of thing, which is, yeah, that's amazing. That very much prepares you for Lafferty, because I think that's kind of his background as well. But I'm curious, when you encountered like Past Master and then we're getting familiar and 900 Grandmothers and all that, had you read, well, you'd read Gaiman presumably because of the blog, so some kind of fantastical fiction, but like, what was your familiarity at that time with genre fiction, with science fiction and that kind of thing? And if you could fold into that, speaking to any resonances or how you have found Lafferty in relation to your other studies like Joyce and stuff. So if you could say a little bit about Lafferty and your reading of science fiction when you encountered him and onward, and about Lafferty in your other reading like Joyce and so on.
I would say, like, I was just exploring a lot of, when I was doing Lafferty, I was exploring a lot of just like fiction that was like recommended in random places, just like, and usually looking for the odder, trying to find odder stuff, stuff that was like less, it wasn't the bestseller stuff, So I did go through a phase of reading a whole bunch of, after I was sort of seeking the Tolkien high in epic fantasy. I'll say, like, there's a really interesting book, a fascinating book that came out in the past year called Big Fiction, by an author named Dan Sinekin, that talks about the sort of like the business of publishing, and how genre publishing is a function of, really like the publishing houses invented it, like, and it filled these labels and then recruited people to do it, and that's how you get epic fantasy. Is that Lester Del Rey, like, and it has, epic fantasy is not a thing that exists. It doesn't start with Tolkien. It starts with people who like kind of want Tolkien, but they want it refracted through, like, what they remember of him, and they're coming to the 60s and 70s, and what they want is just like big, like, doorstop books within these settings, and then so you get people like Terry Brooks who like fulfill that need, but without really doing anything interesting with it. That's sort of, to my mind, is very much in heroic tedium territory. But so so these genres were merchandise, were marketing categories, first and foremost. And so I was sort of feeling my way through it and trying to find writers that like didn't make me feel like it was just like this exercise in in paint by numbers publishing. It's not it's not the suspense novel where it's just like the chapters are like 2 pages a piece, and full of like single sentence paragraphs. And it's also not the you know, and some of it was like, some young snobbishness there, absolutely. But even so, like the other part of me, I really like bad things. I like bad art.
Hmm.
Art that's doing its best, maybe is
Yeah.
a way, and sort of like a real appreciation for outsider art that comes
Hmm.
into there.
Hmm.
Which Lafferty definitely is infused with the spirit. Outsider art, and never meaning that in a dismissive way. It's just somebody who doesn't have the same level of training or didn't come up
Hmm.
in the fields and doesn't have the connections in the same
Yeah.
sort of way that people do. And so they don't have the assumptions maybe about the fields that other people. So I was looking for people who did fiction differently.
Hmm.
Um, you know, and so that's where I got Lafferty. I pulled up to think some of the, I started getting really big into, again, just weird authors like Cordwainer Smith was another a big author that I discovered, read, quite a bit at the time. James Tiptree Jr. I was filling in some gaps. I was reading Le Guin. I was reading some of the other things. I read a lot more fantasy probably than science fiction,
Hmm.
but I
Okay.
did I didn't really read a huge amount of the classics. I had read some Asimov. I had read some Heinlein when I was a younger kid, but I didn't really return to it at that point. I was like, I'm okay there until I need to go back and like read it seriously to pull something out of it, which I had the chance to do at Liverpool.
Mm.
Um, but uh, my relationship to genre fiction at the time was, I wanted to read genre fiction, but I wanted to read genre fiction that did something for me. That
Hmm.
that wasn't just like a unit of fiction, like extruded out of the marketing machines. And when you're working at a Barnes and Noble or a Borders, as I did I did both places, you can really get a sense really quickly of like, oh yeah, this exists to sell X number of copies. Like that's what you're going to move through, and then you're already writing the next book before that one hits the stands, and like there's not a difference in idea or anything. It's just
Hmm.
a continuity of a certain setting that people wanted to have, and I wanted something different. So, or yeah, I would read um, John Harrison's Veraconium. Like that's
Okay.
another like a big science fiction one.
Mm.
Or yeah, like all those sorts of things. And pulling those together, reading just weird stuff.
Mm.
You know, Lovecraft, Ligotti. I sort of started getting into horror, but not like I've always been a coward with horror. So I've always sort of like I can't really I can teach it because then I can filter it through my students' responses.
Mm.
But I'm always with horror. I'm a little shaky, but a lot of weird fiction.
Mm.
Again, as things that are doing things different ways.
Mm.
So that's what I was looking for in genre fiction, and certainly found that in Lafferty and in Spades,
Mm.
because he managed to do things differently and be very funny at the same time, funnier than any other writer I had certainly encountered, other than maybe like very just like pristine P.G. Wodehouse,
Mm.
but like the level of the writing, um, and that was where I came out with him.
Okay.
When I was started reading other writers, getting to grad school and getting back into these big name writers,
Yeah.
that St. John's the curriculum leaves off in the start of the 20th century. Like you get
Mm.
into, so you might get to the very end and read a couple of Flannery O'Connor short stories. That's
Yeah.
usually like that end point of where fiction gets you.
Okay.
So I hadn't read Joyce up to that point. I read a Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and hated it. When I was a young man, I read, a couple of stories from Dubliners. Those were okay. I didn't go any distance at all into Ulysses, and certainly not in Finnegan's Wake. Um, and so but once I came back to it through the grad school lens, which also sort of helped me reclaim some things. I had a terrible, terrible English teacher my senior year of high school,
Mm.
who made us read, gave us the worst possible experience of reading Great Expectations, and just like it ruined it for me. I was like, I don't want to read this. I don't want to read this again. Like this was terrible, and just had to realize like it was the experience of doing it with that teacher that was bad, because Great Expectations is a sublimely weird book. It's so strange.
Mm.
It's so bizarre.
Mm.
Almost incomprehensibly weird as a book.
Mm.
Um, and so it made me, grad school made me alive again to how strange even just like, fiction can be these big books, that Moby Dick, reading Moby Dick again in grad school after like, reading it as a 20-year-old and being like, yeah, this is good. This is better than I thought it would be. It was kind of boring at times, but then going back to it in grad school, only 5 or 6 years later and thinking, oh no, I'm absolutely wrapped in this. I'm so glad I came back to it. Please give me more whaling terminology, Herman Melville.
Yeah.
And so like going back to those books and reading them, coming back, and discovering the modernists all over again, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, William Faulkner, but even sort of pop modernism, discovering like one of my advisors who was really big on magazines. That was one of the things he did, which was like, and so getting into the pulp magazines again, not as like, a fan of science fiction, but like, what is this category of thing called pulp? How does that exist? What gets published there? So learning to read like Dashiell Hammett all over again and stuff like that. So it really invigorated me and prepared me, I think, for Lafferty to do a thing where he's working in these outlets that are maybe, only starting to become respectable at the time that he's doing it. Galaxy is maybe starting to become a respectable magazine, but science fiction had been in the shadow of John Campbell for such a long time, because he had the biggest magazine, he paid the most money, and so he could basically control what science fiction was, and that control was starting to break down. New people were bringing in new ideas, new voices were possible. There's a lot of excitement in the field, and that felt very similar to what I was seeing in modernism, where they're like, well, what can we get away with? What can we do here? What is possible? What can be done without in fiction? What can you experiment with? And Lafferty just takes that freedom and runs with it.
Yeah.
The example I always give is like, this is later in his career when he's doing this, and he has no qualms at this point. He wouldn't have done this earlier in his career, but what he does in East of Laughter, where he introduces the book by listing 15 characters and then saying like these are like the dozen or something like that, because some of them are duplicates, or some of them are like it's just like, what are you doing, man? Like, you can't just say like, I'm introducing you to these characters, like, not, some of them aren't going to make it, like, that some of them aren't necessary, but like that's the brassiness of that. There's the sheer audacity of just like, yeah, I'm doing this and I'm going to get away with it, and you're on board for the ride. Of the very best sort of like storytellers and conversationalists, except he's managing to do that big lie, sort of big whopper sort of storytelling in prose in a way that is extremely difficult to do. So many people have tried to copy him, and so few have succeeded to any degree whatsoever.
Yeah, it's just, I've tried it. It's just not a good idea. So a couple things there are that. Okay, let me gather my thoughts here.
Some black galactic thing is born. Start, children, start.